Well, it's time to put on our Sherlock Holmes cap as we take a look at digital forensics coming right up.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello and welcome to ACI Learning. I'm your host, Zach Moos for NIST Cybersecurity and Risk Management Frameworks. And with us, as always, is the one and only Adam Gordon. Adam, good to see you, sir.
That's all I got. Just woo. How you doing?
I'm doing really well.
Good, good,
good.
good.
We're in the respond function and the analysis category in the respond function. Can we look at that a little bit more in depth?
So, we can definitely talk about that. Yeah. I like that idea, as you gave us in the intro, the teaser about, putting on our Sherlock Holmes chapeau. And you can't see it in the studio as you're watching with us, but look at the monitor in between our feedback monitors. Isn't that appropriate for Sherlock
London.
Holmes?
It's London.
It's a foggy London, which is even better
foggy
for Sherlock Holmes and a mystery.
Great.
So we like that. We have a monitor that spins Google-sponsored photographs randomly for our timing mechanism behind the scenes here, and happens to be on a foggy day in London. So it's just very appropriate. So I like the way we're starting off our conversation. And when we think about and take a look at the respond function, and we think about digital forensics and how that all comes together and how we do this analysis that Zach was just describing and talking about with us, we have to think about the fact that part of response is going to be digging deeper into what's gone on. It's easy to say, well, let's just go stop that bad actor. Let's go, take them and their access away from the system so they can't do any more harm. Okay, well, check. We took care of that. We've got our incident response plan. We just talked about different ways we could do that and how that might be appropriate. But there's more to incident response than just saying we stopped the bad guy or the bad girl, because it could be one or both. It could easily be that they've done some harm and maybe we don't realize it for a period of time. Maybe they're not around to be stopped by the time we realize something's gone wrong. Now we have to be more of a sleuth, more of that Sherlock Holmesian kind of character. And as a result, we have to look at what the evidence is, or the lack of evidence that may be there, to better understand what is going to have transpired, so we can begin to think about what we need to do differently to prevent it from happening again. That's really what we are thinking about with regards to the respond function, but specifically the analysis category with regards to the response function. Now, we've got a lot of detail in the analysis category as well. We're on the screen looking at a capture of the first three elements associated with the subcategory tasks. There are a total of 5 we're going to go take a look at in the document in just a moment. But we do want to be able to understand and think about the logic of this, because it is going to be important. And we do want to spend a few minutes just going through the detail, making sure we're comfortable with the kind of activities that we expect are going to drive analysis, but link them to the idea of digital forensics in one way or another. Let's begin by just making sure we're comfortable with this idea of what the analysis category means. Analysis is conducted to ensure effective response and support recovery activities. Little bare bones on the language there, but what we really mean is that what we expect to derive from analysis is the ability to understand that we are not only responding, but responding effectively given the nature of the incident, whatever that may be. If the incident involves one computer only, well, we shouldn't be wasting a lot of time on 5 or 6 other things that don't have to do with the computer. Let's focus our activities on that computer. If it involves a lot of computers, let's broaden our search and make sure we do all that. So we want to scope our ability to respond based on analysis to understand that we are effective. Okay, I get that. That makes a lot of sense. Let's look at our subcategories and let's begin to understand what those tasks may be. RS for response, AN for analysis. RSAN number 1, notifications from detection systems are investigated. Well, we need to make sure that when something tells us that there may be an informational item, something that's occurred, an event, an incident of worth and note, that we actually trot ourselves over and pay attention, whether it's physically or logically. In other words, if something happens, we should pay attention, but not just pay attention, we should actually investigate. Now, investigation may or may not involve digital forensics, but we can certainly make the case that if it is involving a computer system and that system is in some state of compromise, that we need digital forensics to help us to unravel what that may actually be. The goal of digital forensics, the mechanism that we're talking about when we decide to use digital forensics, is the examination of an information system, in this case a computer system, but any kind of device, in a way that is going to capture information, evidence of things that have gone on, whatever the incident may be, to do so in a forensically sound manner, meaning we're going to use proper techniques, We're going to capture dynamic live data that is in the system before we shut the system down to have an accurate representation of the current state of that system at the time that it was impacted. We're going to use not just a forensically sound approach, but we're going to capture that information and then identify it, do what we call tagging and bagging that information to uniquely give each of those elements an identifier that could be used to track it throughout the chain of evidence or custody, chain of evidence that we create around that information. And to do so at every step in the process so that we understand that if that evidence is going to ever have to be presented in a court of law, we don't know for sure if it ever will, because it's hard to say at the beginning of an investigation if we're going to wind up in a court of law down the road or not, but we have to operate from the assumption that we will. So all the activities we engage in will be appropriately not only executed, but appropriately, properly framed, and that we will act accordingly so that we gather that evidence in a way that doesn't allow us to compromise or modify the evidence, but that it is able to tell the true story of what went on. When we see oftentimes in movies and TV programs, when we see forensic examination of a crime scene, right? So something happens, we see the police and the evidence technicians on site. They have the yellow caution tape around everything. They have the little yellow tents with the numbers to indicate where various pieces of evidence may have been found along the crime scene. And then usually, inevitably, there is a computer involved somewhere. And so they have to take it back to the lab and do all sorts of stuff with it. Everything is given a number, uniquely identifying it as number 5, number 7, whatever it is. We photograph the scene to understand exactly where everything was in relation to everything else. And then we gather that information. And notice they're always wearing gloves. They might have protectors on their shoes and things like that to prevent them from shedding any additional material or getting their fingerprints on anything or smudging fingerprints that are already there, because we don't want to wreck any of that evidence. We want to capture it accurately. And digital forensics is that same idea, but applied to the digital world. We're not worried about smudging a fingerprint on a door when we think about digital forensics. We're worried about what's the impact of me sitting on the computer, checking to see whether or not I can order coffee at Starbucks on the way to the lab, right, before I take the computer in to examine it, because that information that's coming in from outside in that system is now compromised and changed because I went web surfing for a couple of minutes on the computer that whatever might have happened on. So we have to observe that same thought process when we think about digital forensics. It's very, very important. So we want a notification that might need to be investigated, right? And number 2, the impact of the incident is understood. Well, we've talked about the value of understanding something's happening and awareness of that. We begin to see forensics showing up in AN number 3. Forensics are performed. Well, we've just talked about the logic of what forensics are, but think about it. Unless we investigate things that seem to be important and that are happening, unless we understand the impact of the incident, and it is understood so we know that it's important, the use of forensics is probably not going to matter, because we're probably not going to realize that we need to observe those particular specific approaches and those specific ideas that have to be brought to bear to engage the evidence in that way. We're probably not going to act that way. So it is important that we do those things first. And then it's important for us to understand in number 4 that incidents are categorized consistent with our response plans. We've talked about the alignment of the response plan and why that's going to be important. We've also talked about the fact that processes in number 5 are established. This is what I just went through, where we can get this information in, but we can also understand it in the context, both internally and externally, of what's going on in the organization around the incident itself. So processes are established to receive, analyze, and respond to vulnerabilities disclosed to the organization from both internal as well as external sources, third-party vendors and things like that. Taken all together, the idea of how we are responding, but specifically how we're responding with analysis, which is the subcategory that we really want to be thinking about here, is going to be important, or the category and subcategory tasks that we want to think about is really important here, because this is going to allow us to understand how we can actually drive the use not only of forensics, but more broadly, we're going to be able to drive the use of all of the recommended subcategory tasks. And by doing so, how we're then going to bring digital forensics to bear, how we're going to be able to use it effectively to be able to drive our conversation around gathering, distilling the evidence, analyzing it, understanding it. But beyond that, how we're also then going to be able to drive our investigative process and our data acquisition in an appropriate manner. Let's review some of the stuff we just talked about. Let me go through some things quickly with you, not only to remind us of what we just saw in the document, but kind of summarize in a nice way for us all the things that we just discussed. I share with you the purpose of digital forensics to recover data from computers, any device, right? Not just a computer, but a handheld device like a mobile device, a smartphone. They all fall into the same category. So to recover data from computers, devices used as evidence during criminal, civil, or intellectual property investigations, which may, by the way, end up in a court of law, as I suggested to you. So you want to be aware of that. Encompasses the investigation, recovery, and analysis of those materials found in or on digital devices as part of incident response. We just talked about that. And as I mentioned and made clear, should follow specific techniques to ensure the overall integrity as well as survivability of the evidence collected through a chain of custody. You heard me say chain of custody, chain of evidence, and I described the logic to you of that. Those terms are often used interchangeably, but it's that idea that from the moment we find evidence until the moment it is no longer necessary and is either given back to the original owner or is destroyed because for whatever reason it's no longer valuable, that every activity, every interaction, every thought process that attaches to that evidence in any way is documented. Because if you touch that evidence, we don't have a chain of custody, a chain of the evidence and who was using it, under what conditions, and where and why and for how long. It's possible the integrity of that evidence may be compromised. And if the integrity is compromised, the evidence is no longer valid and cannot be allowed into a court of law. The judge has an obligation to exclude that evidence. No matter how impactful it is to the defense or the prosecution, it can never be allowed in the trial. And we've seen evidence of this, no pun intended. We've seen evidence of this in some landmark trials, right? You could think of several really big trials where evidence and the integrity of evidence via perhaps a messing up or not a complete observation of the chain of evidence, chain of custody being observed, has led to evidence that should have been included being excluded. And of course, as a result, things perhaps not turning out the way that we were anticipating, let's say, that they should. I'm thinking about the O.J. Simpson trial.
Oh, sure.
One example, just, one of many, many of them. But if you think about it, right, the fact that there was some question there as to how the evidence was handled and whether the gloves and the knife and some of those things could or could not be admitted because of the fact maybe they weren't properly examined and properly maintained, that can lead to a lot of questions about the outcome of a trial, and that may or may not be a good thing, right? We don't want that to happen. So keep in mind, right, that we do need to understand digital forensics from that perspective. I mentioned we also want to focus on the investigative process. Now, we've outlined at a high level some of those thoughts. Processes and procedures must be followed when collecting evidence. I made that clear. It's a very specific way that we do these things. The chain of evidence and or chain of custody must be documented and recorded. The who, the what, the when, and the where must be accounted for every activity and interaction around that evidence from the time we identify it until the time it is dispersed or destroyed. Very important. And the preservation of evidence, as I mentioned, is also very critical here. Probably the most critical thing. Only trained forensic professionals should be allowed to gather, handle, and analyze evidence. This is why you see the crime scene technicians are identified specifically, and they are the ones that come in and deal with that. We don't just have random people picking stuff up and putting it into bags, because that just doesn't really end well. Maintain the integrity of original evidence, prevent accidental modification and or disable communications by devices not being allowed to work so they don't inadvertently download data like I was discussing. And evidence must be admissible, authentic, complete, reliable, and believable. And let's talk about data acquisition, kind of rounding out our conversations, right, with regards to the investigative process and just the idea of digital forensics overall and how we do all of this. When we think about data acquisition, we're thinking about elements that are going to really impact our ability to not only get data. Acquiring an acquisition means to actually take possession of that data, that information, that evidence. Remember to do so in forensically sound ways we've been talking about. So maybe we'll interview witnesses. Maybe we'll use some hashing and the ability to have an integrity mechanism that hashing represents to verify the integrity of data and a system in its current state so we can refer to that state over time, always ensuring that it has not been modified. Therefore, the chain of evidence, chain of custody has been maintained. Maybe we'll take a look at capturing system images, operating systems, applications, data, etc. We have to do that, but do so again in a forensically sound manner. We would use what are called write blockers. A piece of hardware that allows us to understand the details of the data on the system and to capture a forensically sound bit-by-bit copy that is accurate, but to do so without writing back, hence called a write blocker, we don't write back any data in the process, affecting the nature of the information, the data on the original system. So very important to be trained in how to do these things. Network traffic and logs should be captured and analyzed. Record time offsets or recording of time offsets should be done. The idea behind it is we have something known as NTP, the Network Time Protocol, which will allow us to be able to authoritatively and definitively say, well, this information occurred, this event happened, this thing was done at this time, and from this time to now, the delta, the offset is X, so we understand that flow and that logic with regards to the chain of evidence, and then screenshots and or pictures can be taken, not only of literally the layout of the screen as you're looking at on my machine right now, but the entire experience that we have in the room. If we go to the wide shot for just a minute, we think about this, if we're potentially saying this is a crime scene, hypothetically, it would be important, don't touch anything because it's now got to be forensically sound. It would be important to know that Zach's pad, his analog recording device, is right here in this position, really up against the microphone right here. The cable for my machine, the cable for Zach's machines are in that exact position, plugged in the exact way, because this is all part of the evidence associated with this particular scene, and taking screenshots or taking pictures of this would help us to reproduce that later if we had to speak to this authoritatively in a court of law. So it's actually really important.
Well, how do we bring all this information about, digital forensics and incident response? How do we bring it together in a practical way?
A practical way.
I've said the word practical again.
We should have like a banner or something that unfurls. Sirens should go off. Sounds should happen. Confetti should be blowing out of cannons. And we should say, ta-da. Say it with me.
Ta-da.
Ta-da. And we have a self-directed exercise, another opportunity for us to encourage you to think about the information, the discussions we've been having around digital forensics, incident response, analysis with regards to how we respond as we look at the response function, and to think about not only what we would do, but how you would then carry that conversation forward. We've given you a list of 4 questions that should be helpful in this regard here. Encourage you to look at your workbook to be able to do so, follow along with us. And of course, you have those questions recorded there. Encourage you to answer them thoughtfully, either now or perhaps between now and the next conversation you join us for. How many of these particular incidents that we have talked about and that you may be thinking about, perhaps over, again, several years, I gave you a wide timeline on this. How many of these that we are thinking about, and how many of the clients that you may be thinking about during this time frame had incidents that required some sort of digital forensics response component? In other words, have you been a part of, as an IT professional, an incident response team that required digital forensics to do its job? As an audit professional, have you been involved in executing one or more incident responses that may involve digital forensics? If so, think about those and think about how many have occurred. If not, you might know a colleague, a peer, somebody who has. Maybe you could share these questions with them and ask them to help you kind of reason through the logic of it. When it's a group activity, you're getting more points of view. It could even be more valuable over time. Perhaps there's nobody directly that you know as a peer or colleague, but maybe somebody at work that is on this team would be willing to spend some time with you. Lots of ways for you to think about this information. How many of them had a digital forensics response capability internally, meaning the clients that you may be thinking about, as part of a CSIRT, a computer security incident response team? In other words, what I'm asking you to consider is how many companies have an internal dedicated resource team that is designed specifically and deployed specifically to do these exact things. What would you recommend to a client concerned about digital forensics response and how to undertake it? Do you have the voice of experience? Can you speak to a client about it? If not, can you talk to people that have and maybe share some of that wisdom? Do you have a set of tools to help facilitate a conversation with a client about digital forensics response planning? If not, where would you go to gather those tools and figure out what they should be? Again, maybe talking to professionals that are doing this or have experience with it would be a good way to think about that.
Because of you, sir, you make digital forensics elementary. Thank you very much. You see what I did there. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching ACI Learning. I'm Zach Memis.
I'm Adam Gordon.
And we will see you again very soon.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.